welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the IFG for our Christmas party. You know that we're a cerebral and extremely serious lot, so we didn't think you could have any drinks at all before you considered a great matter of state. And as you've seen, my colleagues at the Institute, knowing I'm leaving at the end of the year, thought that it would be fitting to organise a gig on the subject of great resignations. Now, James kindly came to perform as the great resigner. The problem for me is that whilst I'm very comfortable with leaving the IFG, because I'm leaving it in the extremely capable hands of Peter Riddle, who's here on the front row, I'm not at all comfortable about talking about James's resignation for obvious reasons. So I'm delighted that Matthew has come to take on that task, and they will be doing a double act in due course while I will remain mute. However, I thought I should, to kick things off, offer a few reflections about ministerial resignations and what they signify. Looking back over the modern era, which I take being a historian to be about the last 200 years, I'm struck by four things. Firstly, ministerial resignations aimed largely or solely at bringing down the Prime Minister without much fear for the consequences can sometimes work. They famously worked in the case of Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe, who helped finish off Margaret Thatcher, but neither of them held office again. My second reflection is that dramatic resignations aimed at enabling the resigner to return in glory to lead their party generally fail. If you want to get to the top, don't resign, is the general rule. He who wields the dagger never wears the crown, and all that. Michael Heseltine never recovered from walking out on Margaret Thatcher in 1986, and would almost certainly have done better to have stayed put. Ditto Roy Jenkins, who walked out as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party to Harold Wilson in 1972. Ditto Bevan in 1951, who even provoked the equable and understated Attlee to say that Bevan's problem was that the green-eyed monster had taken over. Ditto Joe Chamberlain, who managed to resign from both parties, for the Liberals and the Tories. He resigned on Gladstone in 1886 and on Balfour 17 years later and succeeded neither of them, though he badly wanted to. However, this is a general and not an invariable rule. Eden's post-war credentials were burnished by having resigned on Neville Chamberlain, when Chamberlain, of course, after the war, was the guilty man of appeasement. And Lloyd George both brought down and replaced Asquith in December 1916 by resigning very dramatically over the conduct of the war. The moral appears to be it takes a world war to be able to wield the dagger and wear the crown. So unless you see one of those coming, or think you're in a position to bring one about, then you're probably better to stay put. My third reflection is that if you're going to resign and recover from it, you should do it in your 30s, when you're thought to be young, juvenile, and able to grow up properly, and not repeat these indiscretions in future. Both Wilson and Gladstone resigned at the age of 35. Both claimed to be resigning on great points of principle, but both quickly forgot those points of principle and came back into the fold. The one I like best, because Wilson's resignation is very boring on prescription charges, Gladstone is much, much more interesting. He was continually trying to resign in his early 30s. He first tried to resign at the age of 33 as Vice President of the Board of Trade because he objected to the proposed amalgamation of the bishoprics of Bangor and St Asaulf, which it was proposed should be merged so that a new bishopric of Manchester could be created. This was a resigning matter. Having failed to resign on that when he became President of the Board of Trade, he tried to resign in order to persuade Peel to make him special envoy to the Vatican because he wanted to open diplomatic relations with Rome for reasons that nobody could quite fathom at the time or after. Then, perversely, 21 months later, he actually did resign over Peel's decision to fund a Roman Catholic seminary near Dublin. 50 years later, when Gladstone looked back on this resignation, he wrote this: "I have difficulty in conceiving by what obliquity of view I could have come to imagine that this was rational or in any way excusable. And this seems to show me now that there existed in my mind a strong element of fanaticism." He wrote that while at the age of 84, while he was Prime Minister for the fourth time. So he clearly recovered from his youthful indiscretions, and Gladstone's great motto, he's my great hero, his picture is in my office, is that he was a learner all his life, so he certainly learnt from the experience. So there's some hope for you yet, James, over the next 40 to 50 years. My fourth comment is that Churchill, as ever, is the great exception. Churchill resigned at the age of 40 in a great huff and indeed considerable bitterness at Asquith after having been demoted after the Dardanelles, and we all know what the future had in store. But then Churchill carried it off in the most remarkable style. This was his letter of resignation to Asquith. My dear Asquith, with much respect and unaltered personal friendship, I bid you goodbye. I do not feel able in times like these to remain in well-paid inactivity. I therefore ask you to submit my resignation to His Majesty the King. I am an officer and I place myself unreservedly at the disposal of the military authorities, observing that my regiment is in France. This prompts the thought that what James should have written to Gordon Brown, instead of all that verbiage, was as follows. My dear Gordon, with much respect and unaltered personal friendship, I say goodbye. I do not feel able to be a welfare reformer while remaining in well-paid inactivity. I therefore ask you to submit my resignation to Ed Balls. I wish to become an officer and place myself unreservedly at the disposal of the military authorities, observing that there are all too many regiments in Helmand. Now, had James written that letter, one of two things would have happened. He would either now be dead, or he would be leader of the Labour Party and about to become Prime Minister. Matthew, over to you.
Andrew, while we appreciate your squeamishness about yourself interviewing or talking about James, when we come to talk a little bit after James and I have said what we have to say, I hope you'll chip in from time to time. I don't think
you'll be able to stop me, but
good.
Equally, I don't think we'll be able to shut up James.
Yes. Now, which of us shall start, James? Because we have to say a few words each, don't we, and then talk to each other, so to speak. Would you like to start?
Yes, of course.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I don't think I've said anything about my resignation in public before, so this is quite... I quite enjoyed thinking about it. But this is a Christmas party, so I thought I would be Scrooge and say resignations bar humbug. Because actually I'm not a big fan of resignations at all. I generally think that we should have more awards for politicians who take a decision about the lesser of three evils and accept the fact that they will be disliked for doing so. I think we should have more awards for politicians who vote for bills that know are going to lose them their seats, particularly if they didn't particularly agree with the bill in the first place. I think there should be awards for politicians who argue viciously against something in a cabinet subcommittee and then lose the argument and go out and defend it brilliantly as a part of collective responsibility. And I think the fact that we do have not quite a sort of a worship of resignations, but a sort of high regard for them as one of the great acts of politics is quite revealing of what we think about politics. I think it reveals some assumptions that we think that essentially engaging with power is somehow suspect, that people do it for reasons of personal motivation, and that compromise is somehow grubby. But I actually think the opposite is the case. I think that compromise is one of the great arts and requires often great courage, and indeed that we should rank compromise above taking a stand on principle. I think it's actually quite easy to take a stand on principle. I think people can feel fantastic about themselves for standing out for 100% of what they feel that they believe in. But if in so doing they leave the field free for their opponents or those who disagree with them to take the decision, what they're doing is making a lot of noise but not actually achieving anything. So I'm on the side of the pragmatists. I'm not on the side of the resigners. I'm on the side of Westminster, not on the side of Occupy Wall Street or indeed anywhere else. And one of the reasons I like community organising so much is that this is one of their great lessons, that actually people, often particularly people who are local activists, who are involved in charities, have a sort of slight discomfort with engaging power. They worry that if they go and get involved with power, either in sort of just by getting into relationship with their local representatives or by taking power themselves, that somehow they're selling out. You know, that people who go in and do deals and get involved with politicians are selling out and not being true to what brought them into their cause in the first place. And one of the things that they do on the 5-day training is they do a fantastic role play about a dialogue about the Athenians and the Melians, and I'll get some of the details wrong, but the essential point is the Athenians are wandering around conquering various island states, and they go to the Melians and say, well, look, we've got you surrounded. As you know, we've laid siege to 3 or 4 places exactly like you in the last few months, and we've won all of those, so why don't you do a deal? We will let you basically keep your way of life, but you have to recognize our sovereignty, and you have to pay taxes to Athens. And the Melians go away and they have a chat about it, and they sort of say, no, we've always stood on this principle of independence and not owing sovereignty to anyone else, so we will stand and we will fight to the death. And they all die. And the point of this is, well, whose side should you be on? Who is right? And most people going on the course start on the side of the Melians, and that they should have stood and fought for their principles. But actually, if they do a proper power analysis and realize that actually the Athenians are pretty good at laying siege to places, and that actually the alternative isn't all that bad, then actually they maybe realize that the reasonable, even maybe the moral thing to do is to compromise and to engage with power. And that's a lesson that used to be pretty deep wired into the DNA of political parties, in particular the Labour Party. There'd always been a sort of quiet tradition in the PLP, which had a very social norm of not rebelling, of agreeing to agree with others, of voting with the whip because that was the moral thing to do. And it came from this understanding that you do that because together you're more powerful. You vote for some things that you don't necessarily agree with because that allows you to get other people to vote for the things that brought you into politics in the first place and that you're most passionate about. So I believe in that argument. I think that voting with your party is a highly moral thing to do. I think that it's interesting that now we value so much the people who don't. I think that's quite resonant of a very sort of 21st century consumerist, slightly self-indulgent view of politics. So having said all that, why did I resign? Well, I guess for the same reason. It was because of power. My resignation wasn't a resignation of principle. It was a resignation of power. I thought that we could win the election under a different leadership, and that we would definitely lose it under Gordon's leadership. And I guess I had thought that for a while in the run-up to my resignation. So thinking about it this afternoon, I was asking myself, well, why did I resign then in particular? And I think 2 things in particular stand out. One I've mentioned before, which is sort of having to go out and defend this sort of McBride affair, which I found pretty hard to do. But actually, I think probably a key thing was a cabinet meeting where I made the argument that we had to start using the word cuts. We had to start being honest about the fact that there would be cuts after the response to the credit crunch had worked its way through. And Andy Burnham came in and started to support me, and Gordon just cut him off in mid-sentence. And at the end of that cabinet meeting, he used to sit sort of where Andrew is now, and he walked past me, and I sat here, and he sort of almost grabbed me by the collar and said, "Come with me," and took me into his study, and basically berated me and told me that I wasn't allowed to say that. I couldn't say that in cabinet. He did say, "Look, James, I've won more elections than you," which is absolutely true. For a long time he was very good at winning elections. And he said, "Look, we won't win this election, trust me, we won't win this election if it's our cuts versus their cuts." Now, I disagreed with him on the substance, but actually I suppose the fundamental thing was that he was telling me I wasn't allowed to say it in cabinet. And that was breaking the bargain. The doctrine of collective responsibility isn't the Prime Minister decides and then everybody else just says what he says. The doctrine of collective responsibility is you'll chip in, and if you lose out, well, the price of getting to be at the table where the argument is made is you then have to go out and defend it. But as the day of my eventual resignation came, I still hadn't decided, and I remember wandering around Hyde, which I represented that morning, and not being able to make up my mind, and sitting down, having, I think, the last cigarette, in sort of slightly self-dramatising way, having the last cigarette I think I've ever smoked, deciding to resign about 11:30, going in, writing my verbiage, as Andrew so carefully kindly described it, then having a rather surreal day going around and campaigning in the European elections. And actually the worst bit of it was the sort of time between 9:15 and 9:45 at my agent's house, knowing I was going to have to ring Gordon up, but sort of the time sort of slowly ticking away. So eventually I rang Gordon, and I went through to Switch, and I'm sure lots of people in this room have rung Switch, and wonderful Switch operator came on and said, oh, I'll try and get the Prime Minister for you. She came back and she said, unsurprisingly, he's not available right now. Maybe you can ring back later. And as people, I'm sure, remember, I had told a couple of people, so I sort of said, no, I'm afraid I really can't ring back later. So then Gordon came on, and actually the thing that's hilarious in retrospect is you could hear people coming on the line. I don't know if anyone's changed this at number 10, but when someone comes on the line and you're just listening, it goes ka-clonk. And there were like 4 ka-clonk noises. So eventually Gordon comes on, and I said, Gordon, I'm afraid I'm resigning from your government. And he went, what? And that's the only word I exchanged with him, because then I said it again. I said, Gordon, I'm afraid I'm resigning from your government. And the next voice I heard, in a sort of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style, was Peter Mandelson's.
Amazing.
At which point Peter said to me, James, you can't resign. Don't be so ridiculous. I can't remember exactly what he said, but you just can't do this. And I said, I'm afraid it's too late. And he went, what do you mean? In his iciest tone. I had to explain that 3 national newspapers and the BBC already knew. So then the weekend was very surreal after that. I was determined not to get doorsteps, so I ended up being bundled into a car and driven to some friends in the home counties and hiding out in their house. And then eventually returning to my constituency house on the Sunday evening. And then on the Monday morning, it looked like everybody had gone. And I came out of my house, and round the corner was a very, very sad-looking Sky journalist. And he said to me, I've been sitting here for 4 hours. I was about to get into my car, so I could have got away. I've been sitting here for 4 days. Please give me an interview. So I took pity on him, and I did. But I guess the main point I make is that when I think back on it, I don't look back on my resignation with pride or with sort of excitement. I look back on it with regret. I wish lots of resigners sort of make it someone else's fault. But I wish I hadn't felt I'd had to resign, and I guess I wish it had worked. I think it's interesting to speculate what would have happened with 20 or 30 more seats and what the Conservative Party would have done to David Cameron if there had been a Labour-Lib Dem coalition.
Andrew offered you Adonis's 5 laws of resignation. James has beautifully, in his own person, exemplified for you what I might call Parris's 6th law of resignation, which is, having done it, don't play the heroics, let other people do that for you. And everybody else has been admiring James's sense of honour and principle, and it's very wise on his part to adopt this slightly cynical line that it wasn't necessarily the best thing to do, but there was much more to it than he suggests. In a moment I want to ask him more about that. I thought I would just, I would first dedicate what few remarks I have to make to, we'll call him Mr. Anthony Price of Winster in my constituency, a one-time stalwart member of the West Derbyshire Conservative Association, who, while I was Member of Parliament, resigned no less than 7 times from the association, omitting to rejoin the association in between his resignations. He resigned over the closed shop, Mrs. Thatcher not doing anything about it. He resigned over her not taking on the miners the first time round. He resigned over us not giving military help to Ian Smith, and I can't remember what the other resignations were. But that's perhaps the 7th law of resignation. Do remember to rejoin whatever it is before you resign from it. I've one simple point to make, and it's this, that if someone is prepared to resign, then it's almost certainly the case that we need them to stay. It's the people who do resign who shouldn't, and the people who somehow don't resign who should. Look through a few of those names, some of which have been going up on the screen and others not. Look at Michael Heseltine. Look at Leon Britton. Look at Geoffrey Howe. More controversially, I would say look at John Redwood. Would be an enormous strength to the government. I think it's a pity that David Davis, who's sitting over there, isn't part of the government, but that, in a sense, was David's decision. Look at Robin Cook. As it turns out, perhaps he didn't have so much longer to live. But which of us think that the governments of which those people, or the parties of which those people had been part, wouldn't have been the stronger for them staying? More controversially, look at Jack Profumo. Maybe he had to resign. Maybe the the virtuous person that he was for the second half of his life would never have emerged if it hadn't been for the circumstances of his resignation. Nevertheless, he doesn't strike me as an obviously more venal or less praiseworthy member of Harold Macmillan's government than any of the others. Look, for instance, at... I was just listening to Howard Davis this morning. Howard Davis, not a politician, but he did very much the right thing with the LSE, and he's gone to Paris. I wish he hadn't gone to Paris. I wish he was back here. Look at Peter Carrington after the Falklands War, and look at his junior minister, Richard Luce. Both of them went. Both of them would have been huge strengths had they carried on in Margaret Thatcher's government. So the fact that a person goes is, I think, prima facie evidence for us needing them and for us wanting them to stay. And the reason is this. On the whole, and we're talking really not about those sackings which are disguised as resignations, but those voluntary resignations of people who didn't have to go. On the whole, people go as a matter of honour. If people go as a matter of honour, that suggests to us that they have a sense of honour, a very strong sense of honour. In most cases, not all, in most cases sacrificing their careers. I suppose John Major's an example of someone who resigned in order to stay in his career, but that's an unusual one. It also tells you not just that they have a sense of honour, and not just that they have some intelligence, but that they are people prepared to take risks. I wonder what that is. It's the call for David Davis. Better late than never. Resigners on the whole have a sense of risk. They are people who are prepared to take risks. And though it isn't true without reservation that risk takers should be in government, I certainly think it's true of our era, of our political era, that we need perhaps people more capable of taking risks rather than people who always play safety first. A sense of honour, a sense of risk, a capacity to take brave decisions. Both those things combine in that. Those are the people we need, and it's always a pity when they go. I thought it was a huge pity when James went, and I don't agree with him that there was no principle involved. There was certainly principle involved, but there was also what I think that letter, which I would love to have redrafted for you. Lots of us would. Much too much about loving the Labour Party, and far too long, about 3 times as long as it should have been. But there was, apart from a sense of how best to win the next election, there was also a sense of the direction of the party having gone wrong. Beneath it, I think what you were trying to say was the Prime Minister is going bonkers, but perhaps you should have spelt that out. Michael Heseltine virtually did spell it out. In fact, it is with that question that I will perhaps kick off the conversation between the three of us. You plainly felt, everybody knew you felt, that Gordon Brown was going pretty much off the rails. There was never any possibility of a rapprochement between you and Gordon Brown after resigning. You had nothing left to lose. If that's what you thought, why didn't you just say so?
I wrote my letter so that if he had, as he did, ended up staying Prime Minister, it wasn't going to be a grievous sort of fatal blow. So I did write it very much with that in mind. So that's why I didn't say it. There were disagreements of policy, although actually that's somewhat exaggerated. People do say, oh, he blocked me on welfare reform. Actually, the first welfare reform, first period, he was very supportive on welfare reform. He stopped one thing which he might well have been right about. But actually, in the run-up to my resignation, I did write him a sort of long set of proposals on what we should do next, and that he didn't take up. So I suppose that contributed to it a little bit. But I think if you're in government and you have to accept that your views are not always going to prevail, and that's not enough for someone to resign. If I thought he'd had a chance of winning the next election, then I would have just swallowed not getting my way and got on with it.
But you didn't think he had a chance of winning the next election, and yet you didn't want to deliver a grievous blow. Why not, if he wasn't going to win the next election?
Well, because it's better to lose on 29% than on 25%. You know, and the sort of I think after the election result, a lot of Labour activists had a sort of feeling of having been in a near-death experience. You know, that you'd kind of had a car crash and woken up, and actually you were sort of walking around, because people slightly forget we were quite close to coming third. People thought we were going to come third, and actually, if I had said things about him which had then been quoted in the general election campaign and lost the seats, I would have felt very bad about it.
You don't think if you'd just kicked a bit harder, he might have gone?
Well, it's hard to say. So what I should have done is to have written a letter which was so horrible about him that he had no choice but to go, because I would have damaged our chances so much.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's quite a high-risk strategy.
Andrew.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude about the letter. It's an excellent letter. No, though I don't myself feel I owe everything in my life to the Labour Party, but there may be some people in this room who do. I don't think the letter, of course, matters at all. It's not the letter that matters, it's the act of resignation that matters. And the question really is, which James is posing, is are you resigning to make essentially a personal statement, or which is what James is sort of saying. It's a personal statement that you just don't think, in all conscience, you can stay and be part of this enterprise under current management, or are you actually engaging in a big political operation to bring about a change? And of course, there's a grey area between the two, and I suppose I put Geoffrey Howe somewhere between the two. It's a personal statement, but others must consider what action they must take to these in these circumstances. The thing I find surprising, and I still find it surprising actually in retrospect too, is that people don't try to mobilise more, because politics is ultimately about the exercise of power. And if you have an opportunity and profoundly think that the direction of the country should change dramatically, then making a big and profound statement about it and seeking to mobilise and bring about that change is probably the best course open to you. And the thing I found, I was a junior minister at the time. I was fortunate in not being in a cabinet, so I didn't have to consider my position in the way that James did at the time. But at this great moment of crisis for the party, there was almost an agreement not to talk and not to cabal and not to do the very thing that could have brought about the change that James said he wanted to bring about. And that I think is tells you a lot about what happens, I suspect, partly when a government's been in power for a long time and it becomes slightly blasé about whether it wants to stay in or not. There isn't this burning determination to stay in. I think also, to be absolutely frank, it tells you something about the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Faced with the prospect of losing power in 1990, this great enterprise, which, apart from a few years after 1997, has existed only for one purpose, which is the exercise of power on behalf of the broad interests that support the Conservative Party. If at any moment it looks as if that might be in jeopardy, it swings into action in the most decisive and ruthless way imaginable, even in 1990 being prepared to depose the most successful leader that the party had produced in a generation. Faced with a similar situation, James walks around Hyde and in his constituency. He doesn't talk to David Miliband. He doesn't have a conversation with the very people who could have brought about the change that he wanted. And we are now having this wonderful conversation deep in opposition whilst the Conservatives run the country, which tells you a lot about the difference between the two parties.
If Peter Mandelson had got wind of what James was planning to do and come to you, Andrew, and said, would you go and have a word with James and try to talk him out of it, what would you have said?
Well, he didn't. So I have no idea what my reaction would have been.
We don't answer hypothetical questions.
I think it would crucially have depended on what I intended to do myself. I think is the only answer. If I didn't, but whether James would have spoken to me before, it would have been, I think, a key determinant. James, though James perhaps might say a little more about this, James, I don't think, did speak to any colleagues before, and therefore they weren't put in the position of needing to either line up with him or seek to dissuade him.
Is that absolutely right? I mean, obviously, if you say you didn't speak to them, you didn't speak to them, but a lot of people think that there were colleagues, David Miliband in particular, who had some sense of what you were going to do and were sort of wishing you well, and that you sort of thought that they agreed with you and might follow you?
No, I've said lots of times that's not the case. And I mean, it's on the record that David and I had spoken in the day, and he did try to dissuade me. He disagreed with it. But over the ever since the Crewe by-election, there had been discussions amongst cabinet members about whether or not Gordon should go. And I had always been of the view that we were going to lose, and I had always been of the view that if there could be a different leader, that would be a good thing. And by the time my resignation came, I sort of had come to the view that no one was really ever going to act. So that there was a sort of strange lack of confidence in people's ability to affect history. I don't know quite, but I mean, really looking back on it, it does feel like a group of people who thought that the historical situation was exogenous to themselves, as opposed to them thinking, I'm a member of a cabinet which gets to decide whether or not the Prime Minister continues. And it feels very different from previous generations in that sense.
Forgive us for, in a sense, focusing on the personal, but I am still struggling to know, in the end, whether you wanted to make a difference or you didn't want to make a difference, whether you wanted it to cause things to happen.
No, I wanted it to. It was the sort of last throw of the dice.
What did you hope would happen?
It was the last throw of the dice, and I hoped that over that weekend there would be a movement which would mean that Gordon would go. And
so
I also maybe naively thought that Gordon should ask himself the question, and indeed I said so in the letter. I still think that the ultimate responsibility was with him, that he continued to lead the party even though it was pretty clear that he was going to lose. But no, there had been conversations over the previous year. I'd come to the view that no one was going to do anything, and this was kind of the last attempt to try and move him.
You said, Andrew, that one of the rules was not to resign too often. Is there another rule which is not to resign from too many parties? Did that ever sort of...
Well, I always took the view, of course, that I know the parties all moved and I stayed consistent.
Everyone always says that.
It was my great hero, other great hero, the hero who was alive, the one who was dead was Gladstone. The one who was alive was Roy Jenkins, who told me, he gave me very strong advice that I should change parties. He said Tony Blair was, of course, his great hero as well. And so they had Tony Blair for Roy was the Gates School, who was, as it were, now alive, and who could do the great things the Gates School would have done if he'd lived in 1963. And he said to me, this is the social democratic leader I've always wanted. He was actually, of course, far too starry-eyed about Tony in the way he had been far too starry-eyed about Gates School, but nonetheless, he was. And he said to me, at your age, he said, and I was then, actually, almost uncannily 35, he said to me, at your age, if you've got two parties that believe the same thing, you should always join the larger, not the smaller. And he said, and of course, what Tony Blair is doing is a reverse takeover of the Labour Party as a modernising social democrat. Well, he was right about all of that. So I don't regret that, but I do think it means that after the age of 35, you've got to stop resigning, and I have managed to observe that rule so far. And I should say I'm not leaving the IFJ on any point of principle whatsoever. This is moving on to another job.
Shall we throw the conversation open to the floor? Are there any questions, points of view? Peter Riddle.
Laura's very cool now.
Hold on, here comes the mic.
Thanks, Amy. Just one thing, but you weren't the only one to leave the government, James, on those few days, because I remember it vividly, because I was one of the recipients of the letters before Gordon knew about them, I think about 7 in the evening. There were other people who were resigning. I mean, there had been some who'd resigned because of expenses, which was going on at the same time, or expenses related. The most significant one was John Hutton, because John Hutton left, and he was as disillusioned with Gordon Brown as you were. Was there any sense there that a bit of momentum would build up?
I think the key thing with John, and I think some others, and indeed Michael Howard said this to me after I resigned, he said the difference between your resignation and Thatcher falling was that there was no prince beyond the water. So lots of people were, in theory, happy to do something, but there was a coordination problem because they thought, well, if there's no one actually standing there saying that they would stand up and challenge Gordon, then what are they actually doing? They're just resigning for for what, really, was the argument that was made. So, in a way, I think that is a more fundamental difference between the Thatcher episode and the Brown one. So, I think if there had been someone clearly saying, yes, I'm prepared to do it, things would have been quite different.
There were about 3 or 4 of you who left the government in those few days. That's the cabinet. You weren't the only one.
Yeah, Caroline.
But John Hutton's the principal one.
Yeah.
On similar reasons. He was a defence secretary and went. And it was no secret he was disillusioned with Gordon.
Well, you said it was no secret he was disillusioned with Gordon. In a sense, we in the press knew various obscene remarks that he was said to have made. But he gave his reasons as being personal, and perhaps I'm naive, but I did believe that there might be a personal reason why John Hutton had resigned. Further questions? Yes, lady with the glasses there.
Bonnie Soanes, Parliamentary Radio. The accepted wisdom is usually that people resign because then they can marshal their allies when they're on the back benches and present more of a threat to the cabinet or shadow cabinets and of their parties. You said, Matthew, exactly the opposite, that once you resign, you disappear, really, from being a threat to everybody. Is that true?
It depends. Michael Heseltine carried on trying to be a threat, but found that he was less of a threat than he had thought. Others do sink without trace. I think Andrew's right. The likelihood of sinking without trace is probably exceeds the likelihood of becoming a dangerous beast on the backbenches. Hand up right at the back there. Hold on a sec, mic coming.
My name's Annie Shepherd. I'm the Chief Executive at Southwark Council. I'm really interested in this part of the debate about honour and power. So why were the press told of your resignation before the Prime Minister? And why didn't we feature this evening Mr Mandelson's resignations? Are his resignations different from the resignations we've talked about earlier?
Someone else had to answer for the video. I didn't do it. Brutally, I thought if he'd known earlier, he would have tried to say that he'd fired me rather than me resigning.
There is no honour.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's the perfectly honourable thing to do. I didn't want him to make out that I'd been fired rather than actually resign.
Nothing is easier than suggesting that someone resigned because they knew you were about to fire them.
More interesting are the people who resign because they think they're about to be fired. In fact, they weren't. There's the famous Andrew Smith case, which Tony Blair deals with brilliantly in his memoirs, of Andrew Smith coming and telling him he's got to go. And Tony tried to persuade him to say, no, I've really, really got to go. There's some really powerful, there's an important thing in my life where I have got to resign. And Tony sends Andrew out and gets his political secretary to say, what's going on here? So he thinks he's convinced, and I think he actually has been convinced by Gordon that of course this was all one happy family, that he was about to be fired. And that was the reason why he resigned. So the preemptive resignation, because you think you might be fired, but in fact you weren't going to be fired, that you're then in Alice in Wonderland territory, but I'm afraid a lot of politics is in that place.
And the Mandelson question, why didn't we include
Well,
Peter's
been whispering, he's been briefing me, I'm a ventriloquist here. He says that we weren't doing resignations which were on matters of conduct, because that would have, in the current, with recent history, been such a long chapter of resignations that it was a completely different category.
questions? Hand up there, yes.
None of you have tried, you've all treated political resignations as something completely separate from resignations in other walks of life. And I don't have anything particular observations, but surely there must be some analogies or contrast to draw with, say, the question of whether or how James Murdoch should resign now. Among civil servants, resignation is pretty rare, but there were at least a couple, as I recall, during the Iraq War, or before the Iraq War.
Elizabeth, the lawyer. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, which was clearly a matter of honour. So any comments or observations on that?
Maybe I could kick off in comments on that, and in doing so also answer a point that James made. Although I think there is honour in compromise, and there is honour in soldiering on, and there is honour in playing with the team, even though you don't agree with the captain's strategy, I think it's very important that those in charge, either of a political party or a government or a business, know that there are points past which people won't be pushed. And for that reason, although many resignations may be capricious, frivolous, or even lazy, I think were we to give the impression that it's always the right thing to do to carry on, then a lot of people would be pushed a great deal further than they ought to be. What do you think, James?
No, I think that's right. But if the system of cabinet responsibility is working, then the Prime Minister should get that information and should negotiate a path which is bounded by people's genuine things that they won't put up with. There was an incident in a spending review that I was involved with where the Treasury wanted to make some changes to Nest, the new pension system which is coming in next year. And as part of that negotiation, I said I would find it very hard to stay if that went through. And for that reason, it didn't happen. I think Yvette did the same on exactly the same question the next year. So the system does work like that. I mean, of course, there are great issues of principle. I'm not saying that there aren't, and some people have sacrificed a lot in their name. All that I'm saying two things really. One is we valorise that more than we do the putting up with it and compromising, and I think we should value both. And secondly, when you're working out how to get things done, the key thing is to work out how much power you've got. I mean, actually, Saul Alinsky, who's the great father of community organising, when talking about Gandhi's non-violence, says that actually it wasn't because he believed in non-violence, he'd just done a power analysis and worked out that was the way in which he had most power. And there's nothing great and sort of principled about it. It was just a very pragmatic decision. And my key point is you need to analyse your power and try and maximise it.
Yes, there's a hand there first, and then there.
We've talked about resignations. Can I bring in threat of resignation? George Brown, legendary, certainly more than 10 times, he threatened to resign, and the panel's views on when is too many times.
You'll both have more experience than me. Twice, I think, is the absolute limit, wouldn't you say? George was drunk, I suppose, wasn't he, when he...
I need to think about it. I've never... I mean, the rule, I think, has to be you only threaten to resign when you do actually intend to carry it out, and are intending absolutely to do it. But since I can't put myself in that position, because I never did that. I always took the view as a minister, but I wasn't faced with I never had the belief that I myself could determine who the Prime Minister might be, which is a position that James thought he might be able to influence, was that that the causes I believed in would be less well served by my not assisting with them than assisting with them. So I never contemplated resignation. Ultimately, of course, these things, the same in any walk of life, are a matter of conscience. And you can never determine for another person what is going to be their ultimate matter of conscience, particularly when they've got a family to support and they need a salary and all those things which can influence whether you do. I'm surprised more civil servants, coming back to the earlier question, don't resign. Matthew referred to Iraq. A few resigned after Suez. I don't recall in my entire time as a minister knowing a single civil servant who resigned on a point of principle on any matter. But I came to the view by the end, that's partly because I met very few civil servants who appeared to believe in anything much, particularly passionately. So the issue of conscience, I don't think came remotely close to being addressed.
He says that as departing Chief Executive Director of the Institute for Government. Once, I think, would be the answer. I think you can threaten it once.
Robert and then Michael. The gentleman behind you there.
You've mentioned the resignation letter. What about the resignation speech and the use of that? I'm sure, like everyone else, the great one remembers is Geoffrey Howe and the effectiveness. What use did you think you should make of that?
I mean, the moment had passed by the time I could have made a speech, because the PLP had, do you remember the PLP was supposed to be the great occasion. It had been and gone, and it had been a great sort of rousing Gordon must stay moment. But the key moment was the Friday and the Saturday, when both the cabinet decided to stay and what had been promised as a sort of PLP uprising failed to materialise.
Resignation speeches very often don't read as well on paper as they sounded in the circumstances, and in the circumstances in the chamber they may have had the wind of political excitement in their sails. When you remove that, the speech flaps rather limply. I don't think that Geoffrey Howe's speech reads particularly well. I think the idea of a broken cricket bat's a pretty strange analogy, but I remember that in the circumstances, because he was doing it and because he was doing it then, it became very important. Robin Cook's resignation speech, again, it is with a heavy heart. Anybody who uses the phrase "it is with a heavy heart" needs to redraft, but I don't know, what do you think?
The interesting thing about Robin Cook's resignation is that though it was on a point of, I mean, a really serious, profound point of principle, which he believed, and indeed, having sat through those cabinets, he was one of the most controversial decisions a British government has taken since the war, besides Suez. He did speak, I mean, completely straightly. He was one of only two people in that cabinet who did speak completely straight about his difference with the Prime Minister point of principle. He did not want to bring Tony Blair down. If he'd wanted to bring Tony Blair down, wanted to make a really serious lunge at him, he would have spoken immediately after the Prime Minister the following day in the debate on the Iraq resolution. He didn't. He spoke the night before by deliberate design because it would be much less powerful in terms of its impact on Tony. Why did he not want to bring Tony down? Because the next Prime Minister would have been Gordon Brown.
Mike.
I arrived late, and forgive me if you covered this earlier, but I'm struggling, and maybe somebody else can think of an example of a resignation on principle that has actually changed the government or the institution from which the person is resigning, that sort of jerked them into thinking, oh gosh, yes, perhaps we better be a bit more collegiate, or we ought to move to the left or to the right. Has any resignation really brought about change in the institution from which the person has resigned?
The only change that immediately occurs to me is it's often the beginning of the end for the administration. Something goes in the mainspring of the organisation, but whether the organisation changes course, can either of you think of?
Well, the one example I gave in my opening remarks was Lloyd George in December 1916. Lloyd George resigns. He makes it clear he will not stay. Within 2 days, Asquith is gone, and the whole conduct of the war has changed. But, as I say, given that we'd had the Battle of the Somme and everything else to get to that stage, I don't know if you can generalise much from that one case.
Claire Short, somebody asks.
What about it?
She asked her mother first, didn't she? And so the media seemed to know about it. There was much speculation. And then, she seemed to be a bigger politician as a result. So I was using it as a counterexample to the fact that resignation always diminishes you or thinks you
I think Claire was quite a big politician before she resigned, and she was a great Secretary of State at International Development. I thought her resignation wasn't her finest hour. She kind of said she wasn't going to, and hesitated, and then did, and she was rather outdone by Robin Cook, I think, in that respect.
She perhaps left it a little late. In the Museum of People's History in Manchester, which is excellent political museum, they've got a wonderful political poster exhibition there at the moment, posters since 1886, and the archives are incredible, and they have Judith Hart's letter of resignation. She was a Foreign Office minister under the Labour government that had to deal with Ian Smith and UDI, and her letter of resignation was handwritten, then torn up and never handed in, and they still have it torn in half in Judith Hart's own handwriting. If there are no more questions, one more, yes.
Tony King, to ask a question that I suspect has been in the minds of quite a few people in the room, and that is whether James ever considered collecting a group of people who felt as he did that Gordon Brown ought to leave, with a view to going to the princeling over the water David Miliband to see whether he would be prepared to act if it was clear that there were people behind him. I'm implicitly touching on a point that Andrew made about the apparent unwillingness of people to gang up.
I mean, I thought I sort of slightly said that earlier. Yes, over the previous year and a bit more, there were conversations in which lots of people said that they thought that Gordon should go, but weren't prepared to do it. And so there had been attempts to do that, but none of them had come off for all sorts of reasons, which I'm sure historians will chew over merrily for many decades to come.
I think I'll wind up on a slightly trivial note. My own resignation was a minnow amongst the sharks and swordfish, whom we've been talking about this evening. But I resigned simply to get what I thought was going to be a better job. And well, it was in the end, yes. But I thought I should go and see Mrs. Thatcher and tell her. And she asked me in for a cup of tea, and we had the cup of tea, and she talked 19 to the dozen at me all through the cup of tea without letting me get a word in edgeways. And on the number 88 bus on my way to go and have tea with her, I'd worked out what I was going to say and got no opportunity to say it. And just as she put the tea onto the saucer and said, "Well, that was very good of you to call, Matthew," I thought, no, I'm not going to miss this opportunity. So I said, Mrs. Thatcher, there was just one thing I did want to say. As the Whips will probably have told you, I am gay, and there are an awful lot of other gay people in the Conservative Party, even in the House of Commons. And I really think that we, as a party, we should try not to make them feel that they could have, and I was stammering badly, that they couldn't have any sort of future on the centre-right of politics. And I was gabbling on like this. And she reached out and she put her hand on my wrist like that and looked at me with those intense blue eyes and said, "There. That must have been very difficult for you to say." And as I left, Michael Allison, her PPS, took me aside and said, "You said there were plenty in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Could you just tell me who they are?" So, well, on behalf of all of you, can I thank James and thank Andrew? A most interesting conversation. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me at the back? I'm Dennis Stevenson. I'm on the board of IFG, and for the purposes of the scene, and I wouldn't want anyone to read anything into this, I'm the poor man's David Sainsbury. He is currently in Washington. Oh, thank you very much. He's currently in Washington. Can I give you that? He's currently in Washington, and very, very sorry to miss this. Yes, of course, the wonderful debate, but also because it is, I think, the last time Andrew appears in public as director of IFG. Can I just say what a wonderful discussion that was? It was just terrific. And I have no comment to make on resignations, but I think you might like to know a completely true story about James Purnell. I have known James for a very, very long time. I'm a huge fan, I hope a great friend of his. And when he was going to become an MP, I didn't like the idea very much, so I took him out to dinner to dissuade him. Needless to say, I completely failed. Became an MP, and events took his course, and I had to think, well, I got this one wrong. You know, he hasn't done badly, really. You know, he's about 3.5, and he's had 2 cabinet posts, and so on and so forth. And then the resignation came. And this is a tribute to, he's a very understated, thoughtful, very clever, very witty man. I got a text, and he must have had 1 or 2 other things to do that day, which said, "I should have listened 10 years ago. Love, James." Anyway, thank you for a lovely debate. Now, Andrew, I want to say on behalf of the board of IFG and everyone else involved, you have been completely terrific. That you and I sat down, David Sainsbury sat down with you about 18 months ago, and you told us you would chuck yourself into this job with passion and commitment, and you have. You told us what you wanted to do, and you've done that and a lot more. It is not the slightest bit surprising that a flow of highly brilliant papers, written mainly by other people whom you've stimulated, motivated, and encouraged, have come out of this institution. it is not the slightest bit surprising that it's been fun and engaging, and people have loved you and us for it. It is perhaps not surprising you spent a lot of time on trains going around Britain, which you seem to, every time you come to a board meeting, you've been doing a train tour. What is perhaps not surprising, but which you couldn't know and we couldn't know in advance, because at the end of the day, Secretaries of State don't manage great departments. They may lead them, perhaps, is what a superb manager and leader you've been. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much indeed. Now, how much do we care? Quite a lot. But there are 2 points of mitigation. First, you told us 18 months ago, just absolutely straightforward, that you wouldn't stay for very long. You'd stay long enough to do the job. Why wouldn't you stay? Because you said, with your normal simple incisiveness, that at the end of the day you were interested in forming policy. And so I think for all of us, we've all talked among ourselves, have to say we think it's brilliant you're going back to education where you made such a contribution. We think it's brilliant you're going back to educational policy. And I want to say on behalf of IFG corporately and everyone individually, anything we can do to help, we will do. There's a second point of mitigation. A chap called Riddle, sitting in the front row. Andrew's handing on to a younger man, you can tell. That if someone had told you or the board of IFG, whenever it was 4 or 5 years ago, that Peter, having given up the Times, would be appointed as director of IFG, I don't know which group would have been more surprised. When we realized that he was available, it took very little thought. We did all the right proper things, very little time to know what we wanted, and we wanted Peter. He is obviously, I'd say almost scholastically very rigorous, which you're a wonderful journalist, but I haven't quite seen that from your columns. He obviously knows W and W, as I've learned to call it, Rights on Westminster, which you all know, inside out. Everyone loves you. You're very likable. But, just to warn all IFG people here, he bites. And it's the combination of those which is wonderful. So I just want to say again, thank you, Matthew, James, and Andrew for your debate. And once again, Andrew, thank you for everything you've done for us. Now, before we break, we're going downstairs. You heard there was a hint from the girls of Greycoat School who are going to sing carols on the stairs while we drink down below. We are incidentally going to be asked to shell out for their favourite charity, which is The Passage, which I happen to know because I live very near it, which is totally wonderful. So thank you all very much indeed.